Hey there, and welcome to Crime for Sleep. I know you're having trouble falling asleep, so let me keep you company with true crime stories from around the world. Before we dive in, I'm curious, where did you first hear this one? If you enjoy these stories, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Now get comfortable, and let's get into tonight's case. Story 1. My finger had just lifted from the envelope's edge. The fragrance of old paper and dust hung heavier than usual, clinging to the air as if infused with hidden words. Perched in the room's twilight, I pressed my palms down on the desk, feeling the subtle grain of the wood whisper back. A shiver crawled across my skin unexplainably, as though the room had sighed. The letters lay silent, stacked neatly, yet something unspoken lingered, like a pause that hadn't concluded. The faint rustle of their unease shifted my focus, and suddenly the air seemed poised, waiting for a breath to break its taut quiet. I had been organizing my grandmother's correspondence for weeks. The task seemed straightforward enough, sort through decades of letters, keeping what mattered, discarding what didn't. She had been meticulous about preserving everything, each envelope filed chronologically in wooden boxes that smelled of lavender and thyme. The attic room where I worked overlooked the garden, its single window casting long rectangles of amber light across the floorboards. The letter I just opened appeared unremarkable at first glance. Written in careful script on cream-colored stationery, it discussed mundane matters: the weather, a recipe for apple preserves, concerns about a neighbor's health. The handwriting belonged to my grandmother's sister, a woman I remembered as gentle and soft-spoken, with hands that always smelled of rose soap. She had moved away when I was young, maintaining their correspondence until her passing. But something about this particular letter felt different. The ink seemed darker in certain places, as if the pen had lingered too long on specific words. The paper bore an unusual weight, heavier than the others from the same period. When I held it up to the light, faint impressions became visible traces of words that might have been written on another sheet placed beneath this one. I convinced myself these were natural variations, the kind of inconsistencies you'd expect from handwritten correspondence spanning decades. Perhaps my great aunt had pressed harder when writing certain passages, or used different paper during different seasons. The impressions could have come from any number of sources: shopping lists, reminders, drafts of other letters. Yet as I continued reading, my certainty began to waver. Certain phrases seemed to carry double meanings, innocent on the surface but suggesting something more complex underneath. References to the matter we discussed and what happened that evening appeared without context, as if the writer assumed the reader would understand their significance. The room grew colder as afternoon dissolved into evening. I found myself rereading passages, searching for clues I couldn't quite articulate. The familiar scent of dust and old paper now carried an undertone of something else, something metallic and sharp that made my throat tighten. I noticed my hands were trembling slightly as I reached for the next envelope. The tremor seemed to come from somewhere deeper than nervousness, as if my body recognized something my mind refused to acknowledge. The wooden desk felt rougher against my palms, its grain more pronounced, as though the wood itself had become more real, more present. The next letter contained a pressed flower, a small violet that crumbled at my touch. My grandmother had never mentioned receiving pressed flowers from her sister. In fact, I couldn't recall her ever displaying any botanical keepsakes. She had been practical about such things, preferring fresh flowers from her garden to dried remnants. But as the violet's fragments scattered across the desk, a memory surfaced, hazy and incomplete. I saw myself as a child, standing in this same attic room, watching my grandmother burn something in a metal wastebasket. The smoke had been thick and acrid, nothing like burning paper. When I asked what she was destroying, she had turned to me with eyes that seemed older than her years and said simply, "Some things are better forgotten." The memory felt both vivid and uncertain, like trying to recall a dream after waking. Had it really happened in this room or somewhere else? Had she actually spoken those words, or had I imagined them? The harder I tried to focus on the details, the more they seemed to shift and blur. I returned to the letters with growing unease. The handwriting that had seemed so familiar now appeared subtly different in places. Certain letters formed with unusual flourishes, words spaced irregularly across the page. It was as if multiple hands had contributed to the correspondence, each trying to mimic the other's style. The light outside had faded to deep purple, and I realized I had been working for hours without pause. My neck ached from hunching over the desk, and my eyes burned from squinting at faded ink. But something compelled me to continue, as if stopping would mean losing an important thread in a tapestry I was only beginning to understand. The next envelope felt different the moment I touched it. The paper was smooth, almost slippery, and when I opened it, the letter inside was written in pencil rather than ink. The graphite had smudged in places, creating gray shadows that made certain words difficult to read. The content was more direct than the others, less concerned with pleasantries, more focused on urgent matters that remained frustratingly vague. "You must understand," one passage read, "that silence serves us all. What we witnessed that night cannot be undone, but it need not define what comes after. The arrangement we discussed will hold, provided everyone maintains their discretion." I read the passage 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of ambiguity. What arrangement? What had they witnessed? The letter was signed with the same name as the others, but the signature looked hurried, almost desperate. My grandmother had never mentioned any family secrets or arrangements. She had lived quietly, tending her garden, maintaining her correspondence, involving herself in small community activities. The idea that she might have been party to some significant event that required discretion seemed impossible. Yet as I sat in the gathering darkness, fragments of observations began connecting in ways I hadn't expected. Her reluctance to discuss her sister's departure, the way she would sometimes pause mid-sentence when talking about the past, as if catching herself before revealing too much. The locked drawer in her bedroom that she claimed contained nothing important. The pencil-written letter mentioned a location, a place by the water where it had happened. My grandmother's house sat near a small lake, its shores dotted with summer cabins and boat docks. As a child, I had spent countless hours exploring those shores, but there had always been one area my grandmother insisted I avoid, a marshy section where she claimed the water was too deep and unpredictable. I found myself standing at the window, staring out toward where the lake would be visible in daylight. The glass reflected my face back at me, but for a moment the reflection seemed wrong, somehow older, more careworn, as if I were seeing myself through different eyes. The sensation passed quickly, but it left me with an uncomfortable awareness of being observed. Not by anyone in the room. I was alone, but by the accumulated weight of all these preserved words, these carefully maintained secrets. The letters felt less like correspondence and more like evidence, though evidence of what remained unclear. I returned to the desk and opened another envelope. This one contained not just a letter, but a small photograph, a group of people standing beside the lake I had just been contemplating. My grandmother stood in the center, younger than I had ever known her, flanked by her sister and several other figures whose faces had been deliberately obscured by water damage or careful scratching. The photograph should have provided clarity, but instead it deepened the mystery. Why would someone damage a family photo in such a specific way? The scratching appeared intentional, as if someone had wanted to preserve the image while hiding the identities of certain individuals. On the back of the photograph, someone had written a date and a single word, before. Before what? The date meant nothing to me. It preceded my birth by decades, but something about the photograph itself felt significant in ways I couldn't articulate. The accompanying letter was brief and cryptic. The photograph arrived as you requested. I've made the necessary modifications. We agreed this was the safest approach. Destroy this letter after reading. But the letter hadn't been destroyed. Like all the others, it had been carefully preserved, filed away in its proper chronological position. Had my grandmother forgotten the instruction, or had she chosen to ignore it? The meticulous organization of the correspondence suggested nothing had been preserved by accident. I felt a sudden urge to search the rest of the house, to look for other hidden collections or overlooked hiding places. But the rational part of my mind insisted I was overreacting, reading significance into coincidences and normal family quirks. People preserve photographs and letters for sentimental reasons. Families have private matters they prefer not to discuss. These weren't necessarily signs of anything sinister. Yet my body seemed to disagree with my rational assessment. My heart rate had increased, and I could feel perspiration forming despite the room's coolness. The familiar space around me, the same attic room where I had played as a child now, felt foreign and potentially threatening. I decided to examine the remaining letters more systematically, looking for patterns rather than focusing on individual messages. Spread across the desk, the correspondence revealed gaps, periods where the regular exchange seemed to have stopped entirely, only to resume with different paper, different tones, sometimes different handwriting altogether. The gaps corresponded to specific seasons, I realized. Each interruption occurred during the same months, as if something about that time of year made correspondence impossible or inadvisable. The pattern repeated across decades, too consistent to be coincidental. During one of these gaps, my grandmother had taken a long trip, the only extended travel I could remember her mentioning. She had described it as visiting distant relatives, but now I wondered if the timing was significant. Had she been avoiding something that happened regularly during those months, or had she been actively involved in something that required her presence elsewhere? The final letter in the collection was different from all the others. Written on modern paper with a ballpoint pen, it was clearly more recent, possibly written shortly before my grandmother's death. The handwriting was shakier, reflecting her advanced age, but the content was surprisingly direct. "The time for secrets is ending," it read. "The young one will inherit more than just the house and garden. Everything is hidden in plain sight, as we always agreed. Trust that understanding will come when it's needed, not before." The letter was unsigned, but a phone number was written in the margin, a number I didn't recognize, with an area code from a region several hundred miles away. I stared at the number for a long time, debating whether to call it. The rational choice was to finish organizing the letters, box them up, and move on with the practical tasks of settling the estate. Whatever secrets or arrangements had existed between my grandmother and her sister were their business, not mine. But as I sat in the darkened room, surrounded by decades of carefully preserved correspondence, I felt the weight of unfinished stories pressing against my consciousness. The letters had been left for me to find, not hidden, not destroyed, but organized and accessible. The preservation itself seemed like a message, an invitation to understand something that had been deliberately obscured. I reached for the phone, then stopped. Once I made that call, there would be no returning to ignorance. Whatever I learned might change my understanding of my grandmother, my family, perhaps myself. Some knowledge, once gained, cannot be forgotten. The room seemed to hold its breath as I sat with the phone number in my hand. Outside, night sounds drifted through the window insects, distant traffic, the gentle lapping of water against the shore. Normal sounds that somehow felt charged with possibility and threat. My finger hovered over the first digit, and I realized that whatever choice I made would define not just what I learned about the past, but who I became in the present. The letters lay scattered across the desk like pieces of a puzzle I wasn't sure I wanted to complete. The fragrance of old paper and dust still hung in the air, but now it seemed less like the scent of preservation and more like the smell of secrets slowly decomposing, releasing their essence into a world that might not be ready to receive them. Story 2. I stood motionless at the foot of the stairway, focusing on the door handle that seemed to hover without purpose. The house was all angles and silence, yet every creak of the old wood beneath my feet echoed louder than it should. The shadows didn't just stretch, they lined into the corners, creating shapes that shouldn't exist. A cold draft slithered through the gaps in the window frames, unsettling the curtains without any breeze. I knew I was waiting for something, but the air held its breath alongside me. Just as I was about to turn away, a soft, deliberate click disturbed the air, a latch shifting where none should have moved. I knew what that sound meant, the attic door. She had gone up there to hide, just like she always did when things got difficult between us. It was her pattern, her way of avoiding confrontation. The same way she disappeared into that cramped space above the ceiling when the police first came asking questions about her husband's sudden departure. I understood her need for solitude, the way some people retreat into themselves when the world becomes too much to bear. The investigation had been straightforward enough. A missing person case that resolved itself when they found his car abandoned near the interstate. The detectives explained it clearly. Men in financial trouble often just walk away from their responsibilities, start fresh somewhere new. It happens more than people think. His business had been failing, debts mounting, creditors circling like vultures. The stress must have been overwhelming. I had been the one to comfort her through those difficult weeks. She would sit in the kitchen, staring at cold coffee while I handled the practical matters. The insurance claims, the bank statements, the endless paperwork that follows when someone vanishes from their life. She seemed fragile then, almost translucent in the afternoon light that filtered through the kitchen windows. The house felt different now as I climbed those stairs, my hand trailing along the banister that wobbled slightly under pressure. Each step groaned beneath my weight, and I found myself moving more carefully than usual. The hallway stretched ahead of me longer than I remembered, with doors on either side that remained closed. The air grew thicker as I reached the landing, carrying a scent I couldn't quite identify. Something sweet and stale, like flowers left too long in water. But as my fingers found the cord that would pull down the attic ladder, something shifted in my memory. A conversation I'd had with the detective, one that hadn't seemed important at the time. He'd mentioned finding her husband's reading glasses in the kitchen sink, carefully cleaned and placed there as if someone had been washing dishes. That detail had struck him as odd, he said, since most people don't clean their glasses right before abandoning their entire life. I pulled the cord and the ladder descended with a metallic scraping that seemed too loud in the enclosed space. The opening above revealed only darkness, but I could hear something up there. Not quite movement, but the suggestion of presence. The kind of sound a house makes when it's not as empty as it appears. Climbing into the attic, I was struck by how organized everything appeared. Boxes stacked neatly along the walls, labeled in her careful handwriting. Holiday decorations, winter clothes, old photo albums. But there in the corner where the roof slanted lowest sat a single chair facing the small window that looked out over the backyard. She wasn't there now, but the impression in the seat cushions suggested someone had been sitting there recently. From this vantage point, I could see the entire yard below. The garden she'd planted that spring, the tool shed where her husband used to spend his weekends, the patch of earth near the fence line that looked freshly turned despite the season. I remembered helping her plant bulbs there, how she'd insisted on doing most of the digging herself. Her hands had been dirty for days afterward, soil embedded under her fingernails that she couldn't seem to scrub away. The detective had mentioned something else too, how the missing man's car had been found with the keys still in the ignition, but the seat adjusted for someone much shorter than him. A detail that could mean anything, really. Maybe he'd let someone else drive. Maybe he'd changed the position himself for some reason. But standing here now, looking down at that disturbed patch of earth, I began to wonder about the timing of things. She had called me the night before her husband disappeared. I remembered that clearly now. Her voice had been different, steadier than usual. She'd asked me to come over the next evening, said she had something important to tell me. When I arrived, she was calm in a way that seemed almost unnatural. She served tea in her best china, the set she usually reserved for special occasions, and spoke about feeling free for the first time in years. I climbed back down from the attic, my movements less certain than when I'd gone up. The house felt different now, as if the shadows had rearranged themselves while I wasn't looking. In the kitchen, I noticed things I hadn't seen before. The way the floor tiles near the back door were slightly lighter than the others, as if they'd been scrubbed more recently. The faint outline on the wall where something had hung before being removed. Opening the cabinet under the sink, I found cleaning supplies arranged with military precision. Bleach, scrub brushes, rubber gloves still damp despite the cool air. Everything someone would need to clean up after a difficult task. The smell I'd noticed earlier was stronger here, that sweet staleness that reminded me of something I couldn't quite place. My hands shook slightly as I closed the cabinet door. When had I become so suspicious of someone I'd thought I knew so well? But the questions kept multiplying, each one leading to another doubt. Why had she been so insistent about planting those bulbs in that particular spot? Why had she given away her husband's clothes so quickly, before the investigation was even complete? Why had she seemed relieved rather than worried when the police stopped calling? I found myself walking through the house with new eyes, noticing details that had been invisible before. The way certain floorboards had been recently nailed down, the fresh caulk around the bathtub, the missing photographs from the mantelpiece, leaving behind only faint rectangles in the dust. Each discovery felt like a piece of a puzzle I didn't want to complete. In the bedroom, I opened the closet where her husband's clothes had hung. The space was empty now, but something caught my eye. A small stain on the carpet, dark and irregular, that had been partially covered by a strategically placed rug. When I moved the rug aside, the stain was larger than I'd expected, with edges that suggested it had been scrubbed but not entirely removed. The sound of the front door opening downstairs made me freeze. Her footsteps crossed the hardwood floor with familiar confidence, but now they sounded different to me. More purposeful, perhaps, or maybe it was just my perception that had changed. I quickly replaced the rug and made my way downstairs, trying to appear casual. She stood in the kitchen, still wearing her coat, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. There was something in her expression I'd never noticed before, a kind of satisfaction that seemed out of place. She asked if I'd been waiting long, and I heard myself saying no, just a few minutes. But my voice sounded strange to my own ears, as if it belonged to someone else. As we talked, I found myself studying her face for signs of deception. The way her eyes moved when she spoke about her husband, how her hands remained perfectly still when most people would gesture. She mentioned having lunch with a friend but couldn't seem to remember which restaurant they visited. Small inconsistencies that might mean nothing or everything. The conversation felt like a performance, both of us playing roles we'd rehearsed without realizing it. I was the concerned friend, she was the grieving wife, but underneath those familiar parts something else was happening. A recognition, perhaps, that we each knew more than we were saying. When she excused herself to use the bathroom, I noticed she took her purse with her. An odd detail, but then again, maybe I was reading significance into everything now. The sound of running water lasted longer than it should have, and when she returned, her hands smelled strongly of soap, as if she'd scrubbed them multiple times. I made an excuse to leave soon after, claiming I had other commitments. She walked me to the door, her hand resting briefly on my shoulder in a gesture that felt both familiar and foreign. As I stepped outside, she thanked me for being such a good friend, for helping her through such a difficult time. Her words were appropriate, but her tone carried something else. Gratitude, yes, but also something that might have been warning. Driving home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd crossed some invisible line, that by questioning what I'd always accepted as truth, I'd changed something fundamental between us. The certainty I'd felt about her innocence, about the straightforward nature of her husband's disappearance, had crumbled so completely that I wondered how I'd ever believed it in the first place. But the most disturbing realization was yet to come. As I replayed our conversations over the past months, I began to remember things differently. How she'd asked me to help with those insurance forms, guiding my hand as I signed as a witness to documents I hadn't read carefully. How she'd suggested I take some of her husband's tools from the shed, items that might have been evidence if anyone had bothered to look. How she'd made sure I was involved in so many small ways that now seemed less like friendship and more like complicity. The thought that followed was almost too terrible to acknowledge. If she had done something to her husband, if those suspicions growing in my mind had any basis in reality, then what did that make me? An unwitting accomplice, a convenient alibi, or something worse, someone who had chosen not to see what was right in front of them because the truth was too uncomfortable to face. I pulled over to the side of the road, my hands gripping the steering wheel as the implications washed over me. Every kind gesture, every moment of comfort I'd provided, every time I'd vouched for her character to others, had I been protecting a victim or enabling a crime. The distinction seemed crucial, but the more I thought about it, the more blurred the line became. The house I'd just left suddenly seemed less like a refuge and more like a crime scene I'd helped to clean. The woman I'd comforted appeared less like a grieving widow and more like someone who had successfully manipulated my good intentions. But even as these thoughts formed, I couldn't be entirely sure they were true. Doubt, once it takes root, grows in all directions, making everything suspect. As I sat there in my car, watching the sun set behind familiar buildings, I realized I was no longer certain of anything. Not her guilt, not her innocence, and most troubling of all, not my own role in whatever had really happened in that house. The only thing I knew for sure was that the truth, whatever it might be, was far more complicated than I'd ever imagined. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a small voice whispered that maybe that had been the point all along. Story 3. The morning sun filtered softly through the kitchen window, casting delicate patterns on the checkered floor. The scent of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the crisp autumn air seeping through an open window. The clock on the wall ticked in reassuring rhythm, yet something felt wrong. The curtains hung strangely low, brushing against a single shoe standing upright on the chair. The floor creaked where no one stood, as an eerie quiet settled in the once familiar room. The nausea comes first, always first, a rolling wave that starts somewhere behind my ribs and spreads outward like spilled ink on paper. I press my palms against the counter, feeling the cold marble bite into my skin, and try to remember why I'm here. Why I keep coming back to this kitchen, to this moment, to this terrible understanding that sits just beyond my reach. The shoe bothers me, black leather scuffed at the toe, laces tied in a perfect bow. It shouldn't be there on the chair like that, positioned so deliberately, so carefully. Like someone placed it there with intention, with purpose. But whose shoe? The question circles in my mind, a vulture waiting for something to die. I remember hands, not my hands, smaller hands with bitten nails and a thin silver ring on the index finger. These hands were shaking as they poured the coffee, as they adjusted the curtains, as they placed that shoe just so. The trembling was almost imperceptible, the kind of shake you only notice if you're looking for it, if you know what fear looks like when it's trying to hide. The detective asked me about the hands. At least, I think there was a detective. The memory slides away from me like water through cupped palms. There was definitely someone asking questions, someone with a notepad and tired eyes and the smell of stale cigarettes clinging to their jacket. They wanted to know about the timeline, about what happened when, about who was where and why. But time doesn't work the way they think it does. It bends and folds and doubles back on itself. The kitchen exists in all moments at once, empty and full, silent and screaming, normal and impossibly wrong. The shoe is there and not there. The hands are shaking and still. The coffee is fresh and cold and never brewed at all. I can taste copper in my mouth, metallic and sharp, like I've been biting my tongue without realizing it. Or like I've been holding something metal between my teeth, a key maybe, or a coin. The taste brings back the sound of running water, of something being washed clean, of pipes groaning in the walls like the house itself is in pain. The bathroom sink, white porcelain stained with something that might have been rust but wasn't rust. The faucet dripping in a rhythm that matched my heartbeat, or maybe my heartbeat matched the faucet. Drip, thump, drip, thump. The sound echoed in the empty house, bounced off the walls and came back changed, distorted, wrong. I was holding something, standing there at the sink, water running pink down the drain, holding something small and hard and warm from my grip. But when I try to focus on what it was, the memory shifts and blurs. My hand is empty, my hand is full. The water is clear, the water is red, the sink is clean. The sink is stained forever. The phone rang, that much I know for certain. The phone rang and I didn't answer it because I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but stand there and watch the water swirl down the drain in lazy spirals. It rang and rang and rang until the sound became part of the house's voice, part of its groaning, creaking song of secrets. But that was later or earlier. Or maybe it never happened at all. The real question is about the shoe. Why does it matter so much? Why does my mind keep returning to it, circling it like a moth around a flame? It's just a shoe. People take off shoes all the time. They leave them in strange places, on chairs, by doors, under beds. There's nothing sinister about a shoe. Except for the way it was placed. The deliberate positioning, the careful angle, like it was meant to be seen, meant to be noticed, like it was a message or a clue or a cry for help that only I would understand. The house was too quiet that day. Houses should have sounds, the hum of appliances, the settling of wood, the whisper of air through vents. But this house held its breath, waiting for something to happen or something to end. Even my footsteps were muffled, absorbed by the walls like the house was hungry for sound. I found the note later, or maybe I found it first. Time refuses to behave, refuses to line up in neat rows like the detective wanted. The note was folded once, twice, 3 times, making it small enough to hide in a palm, small enough to swallow if necessary. The handwriting was familiar but wrong, like someone had been trying to disguise their natural script but gave up halfway through. I can't keep pretending, it said, or maybe it said, I can't keep remembering. The words swim and shift when I try to recall them exactly. The ink was blue or black or red. The paper was white or cream or yellow with age. The only thing I know for certain is the feeling it gave me, a hollowing out, a scooping away of everything solid inside me until I was just skin stretched over emptiness. The person who wrote the note had small hands, hands that shook when they poured coffee, when they adjusted curtains, when they carefully placed a single black shoe on a kitchen chair. Hands that knew secrets, that carried weight, that trembled with the effort of holding everything together. I should have known sooner. The signs were all there, scattered like breadcrumbs through our conversations, our shared silences, our careful dance around the truth. The way they flinched when doors slammed, the way they checked locks twice, 3 times, 4 times, the way they stared at their reflection in windows as if trying to recognize the person looking back. But I was distracted by work, by routine, by the comfortable assumption that tomorrow would be like today, that people you care about don't simply disappear into the spaces between words. I missed the signs because I wasn't looking for them, because I believed in the safety of ordinary mornings and kitchen conversations and the reliable tick of clocks on walls. The detective wanted to know about arguments. Had there been raised voices, slammed doors, the kind of dramatic confrontations that make sense in police reports? I tried to explain that some arguments happen in whispers, in glances, in the careful way someone avoids touching you when they pass your chair. The loudest fights are often the silent ones, the battles fought with sighs and turned shoulders and the slow accumulation of things left unsaid. We argued about the dishes once. At least I think it was about dishes. Or maybe it was about money or time or the way I left newspapers scattered on the table. The specifics have dissolved, leaving only the residue of tension, the aftertaste of words that cut deeper than intended. They stood at the sink, hands submerged in soapy water, shoulders rigid with unspoken anger. You don't see me, they said, or maybe I imagined they said it. You look right through me like I'm made of glass. I wanted to argue, to defend myself, to point out all the ways I did see them, did notice them, did care. But the words stuck in my throat like stones, heavy and sharp and impossible to swallow or spit out. So I said nothing, did nothing, let the moment pass like all the other moments I should have grabbed hold of and refused to let go. The kitchen window overlooks the garden. Tomato plants in neat rows, herbs growing wild in terracotta pots, a bird bath that attracts cardinals and sparrows and the occasional hawk. It should be peaceful, this view. It should be comforting. But now I can't look at it without seeing the overturned chair, the scattered newspapers, the way the light fell across everything like a judgment. They loved that garden, spent hours kneeling in the dirt, coaxing life from seeds, talking to the plants like they were old friends. Their hands were always stained with soil, fingernails permanently darkened with earth. Good hands, gentle hands, hands that knew how to nurture, how to heal, how to make things grow. The same hands that shook when they poured coffee. I keep trying to remember the last conversation. What did we talk about? What were the final words exchanged? But memory is a liar, editing and revising until the truth becomes indistinguishable from wishful thinking. Maybe we discussed the weather. Maybe we planned dinner. Maybe we sat in comfortable silence while the morning light painted patterns on the checkered floor. Or maybe we fought. Maybe harsh words were spoken, doors were slammed, feelings were hurt in ways that couldn't be easily mended. Maybe the silence in the kitchen wasn't comfortable at all, but charged with anger, heavy with resentment, crackling with all the things we were too proud or too scared to say out loud. The uncertainty is worse than knowing. It sits in my chest like a weight, pressing down on my lungs until breathing becomes a conscious effort. I want to remember correctly, to honor the truth of what happened, but the truth keeps shifting, keeps changing shape like smoke and wind. The shoe is still there. Even when I close my eyes, even when I try to think of other things, it remains. Black leather against the wooden chair, laces tied in a perfect bow. A question mark made of cowhide and rubber, a puzzle piece that doesn't fit anywhere but refuses to be ignored. Sometimes I think I should move it, put it away in the closet where it belongs, restore order to the kitchen, make everything normal again. But I can't bring myself to touch it. It becomes sacred somehow, a monument to something I don't fully understand. Moving it would be like disturbing a grave, like erasing the last evidence of a presence that once filled this house with warmth and laughter and the smell of fresh coffee. The detective called it a person of interest case. Missing, not dead, disappeared, not departed. The distinction matters to them, affects how they fill out forms and allocate resources and explain things to superiors who care more about statistics than stories. But the categories feel meaningless to me. Present or absent, here or gone, the kitchen remains empty, the shoe remains on the chair, and I remain suspended between knowing and not knowing. I dream about the hands sometimes. They're always busy in the dreams, always moving, always trying to accomplish something important. Folding laundry, writing letters, planting seeds, reaching for something just beyond my field of vision. They move with purpose and urgency, like there's not enough time, like something terrible will happen if the task isn't completed. I try to help in the dreams, try to reach out and offer assistance, but my own hands pass through theirs like they're made of mist. I'm a ghost in my own subconscious, powerless to change anything, forced to watch as the familiar hands work frantically toward some unknowable goal. The dreams always end the same way. The hands stop moving, curl into fists, and slowly fade until only the impression of them remains, like the afterimage of a bright light burned into closed eyelids. I wake up with my heart racing and the taste of copper in my mouth, and for just a moment I expect to hear footsteps in the kitchen, the sound of coffee being made, the comfortable routine of another ordinary morning. But the house stays silent, the kitchen stays empty. The shoe stays exactly where it was placed, a guardian of secrets I may never understand. The investigation continues, or maybe it's been closed, or maybe it never really began. Official things happen in official places, forms are filed, reports are written, but none of it touches the reality of the empty chair, the unused coffee mug, the garden slowly returning to wilderness. The bureaucracy of disappearance has its own rhythm, its own rules, its own careful distance from the messy truth of loss. I should probably leave this house, start over somewhere new, somewhere without memories embedded in every surface, without ghosts hiding in familiar shadows. But leaving would mean abandoning the shoe, abandoning the possibility that this is all a misunderstanding, that any moment now I'll hear the front door open and footsteps in the hallway and a voice calling my name. So I stay, I make coffee for two and drink both cups. I tend the garden with clumsy hands that don't know the difference between weeds and flowers. I sit in the kitchen as morning light paints patterns on the checkered floor, and I wait for answers that may never come. The nausea is constant now, a low-grade fever of unease that colors everything I see, everything I touch, everything I remember or think I remember. It's become part of me, woven into my DNA, inseparable from the rhythm of my heartbeat and the cadence of my breath. Sometimes I catch myself talking to the shoe, asking it questions, apologizing for things I can't name, promising to figure out what it means, what it wants, what message it's trying to convey. The conversations are one-sided but oddly comforting, like prayer or meditation, or the kind of desperate bargaining people do when they're alone and scared and running out of hope. The shoe never answers, of course. It just sits there in its perfect stillness, keeping watch over the kitchen, keeping faith with secrets I'm not sure I want to know. But its silence feels patient rather than hostile, like it understands that some truths take time to surface. Some mysteries can't be rushed or forced or solved through sheer determination. And so I wait, in the kitchen where morning light still filters through windows, where coffee still brews in the automatic maker, where clocks still tick their reassuring rhythm. I wait and watch and wonder if understanding will come like sunrise gradually, inevitably transforming everything it touches. The shoe waits too, black leather against worn wood, laces tied with careful precision, positioned just so. A question that might also be an answer, an ending that could be a beginning, a silence that speaks louder than any words I've ever heard. Story 4. The clock chimed twice, though I'd only heard it once. A gentle hum from the radiator rose and fell like a distant echo in a sleeping forest. My eyes traced the familiar pattern of the rug, only to find its colors had shifted into mismatched hues. The blinds swayed, shadows flickering in rhythm with a heartbeat I couldn't feel. The scent of burnt toast lingered, trailing from an empty toaster. As I reached for my mug, its handle felt warm, though I'd yet to fill it. Something had already changed by then. The certainty of it settled in my chest like cold water, though I couldn't pinpoint when the shifting began. Perhaps it was the way the morning light fell differently through the kitchen window, or how the coffee grounds scattered across the counter in patterns I didn't remember making. The evidence was there, subtle as breath on glass, but evidence of what I couldn't say. I think about that morning often now, turning it over in my mind like a stone worn smooth by repetition. The way my reflection wavered in the chrome surface of the refrigerator, distorted and unfamiliar. How my own footsteps seemed to echo from rooms I hadn't entered. The house felt occupied by more than just my presence, though I lived alone and had for months. The suspicion started, I believe, with the photographs. Not that they were moved or missing, but that they seemed to be watching me with different eyes. The woman in the silver frame by the window, her smile appeared strained where it had once seemed genuine. Her hand, resting on an unseen shoulder just beyond the frame's edge, looked tense, fingers slightly curled as if grasping something I couldn't see. I found myself studying that photograph for long stretches, searching for clues in the background details. The blur of trees behind her, the angle of sunlight across her face, the way her hair caught the breeze. Had she been looking at me when the picture was taken, or at something behind me? The more I stared, the less certain I became of what I was seeing. The mail arrived with its usual soft thud against the door, but I began to notice how certain envelopes felt heavier than they should. Bills and advertisements, nothing unusual, yet my fingers would linger over the return addresses, tracing the printed letters as if they might reveal hidden meanings. One envelope, cream-colored and smooth, bore no return address at all. Inside, a single sheet of paper with my own handwriting words I didn't remember writing, in sentences that made perfect sense, yet felt foreign. Sleep became elusive. I would lie in bed listening to the house settle around me, each creak and whisper taking on significance. The heating system cycled on and off with mechanical precision, but sometimes I heard variations in its rhythm, as if someone were adjusting the thermostat in the darkness. The refrigerator hummed its familiar tune, punctuated by the occasional ice maker dropping cubes into the tray, sounds that should have been comforting, but instead felt like signals in an unknown language. During those wakeful hours, I began to reconstruct the days leading up to that strange morning. Had there been signs I'd missed, phone calls that ended too quickly when I answered, the sensation of being watched while walking to the mailbox? I combed through recent conversations, searching for odd pauses or unusual inflections in familiar voices. The grocery store clerk had looked at me differently, I was certain. Her smile seemed practiced, her movements too deliberate as she scanned my items. When she handed me the receipt, our fingers brushed briefly, and I noticed how cold her skin felt. She said something about the weather, but her words seemed to carry additional weight, as if she were really talking about something else entirely. I started keeping a journal documenting these small irregularities, the way shadows fell at unexpected angles, how certain rooms felt warmer or cooler than they should, the persistence of scents that had no obvious source. Reading back through my entries, I noticed my handwriting had begun to change, subtly, letters slanting differently, words spaced in unfamiliar patterns. The telephone became a source of particular unease. It would ring at predictable intervals, but when I answered, the caller would remain silent for several heartbeats before speaking. Even familiar voices sounded slightly off, as if the people I knew were reading from scripts they hadn't quite memorized. Conversations felt rehearsed, with responses that didn't quite match my questions. One afternoon, while organizing old papers, I discovered a receipt for purchases I didn't remember making. The store name was familiar, but the items listed were things I would never buy: specific brands of tea I disliked, magazines I'd never read, a type of flower I found unsettling. The date on the receipt was from the previous week, written in my handwriting, but I had no memory of the transaction. I began to question my own reliability as a witness to my life. Were these discrepancies real, or was my perception somehow compromised? The line between observation and interpretation blurred as I found myself analyzing every interaction, every sensation, for hidden meanings that might not exist. The mirror in the bathroom started reflecting light differently, not dramatically, just enough to make me pause and look twice. My reflection seemed delayed by a fraction of a second, as if the image were traveling a greater distance than the few feet between my face and the glass. I would raise my hand and watch the reflection follow, always slightly behind, like an echo made visible. Food began tasting different, not spoiled or contaminated, but subtly altered, as if prepared by someone with different preferences than my own. Coffee seemed weaker despite using the same amount of grounds. Bread felt denser. Even water from the tap carried a faint metallic undertone I'd never noticed before. I wondered if my taste buds were changing, or if someone else had been in my kitchen, adjusting things in ways too small to notice immediately. The pattern in the hallway carpet started to bother me. I'd walked across it countless times without really seeing it, but now I found myself studying its design obsessively. The geometric shapes seemed to shift depending on the angle of observation, creating optical illusions that made me question what I was actually seeing. Sometimes I would trace the patterns with my finger, trying to follow their logic, but they always led back to themselves in endless loops. Letters arrived addressed to me but containing information that didn't match my life. Bank statements for accounts I didn't recognize, though the numbers seemed familiar. Insurance documents for policies I hadn't purchased, yet the coverage described seemed exactly what I would have chosen. Medical appointment reminders for doctors I'd never visited, scheduled for times that would have been convenient for me. The woman in the photograph continued to draw my attention. I began to notice details I'd overlooked before: a slight tension around her eyes, the way her smile didn't quite reach them, how her posture suggested she was leaning away from something. The background, once simply a pleasant outdoor setting, now seemed ominous in its ordinariness. Trees that could hide observers, shadows that might conceal movement, open space that offered no protection. I started photographing my own daily life, documenting the placement of objects, the arrangement of furniture, the exact position of items on shelves. When I compared these images to my memories, discrepancies emerged. A book that should have been spine out was face out. A plant had been rotated slightly. Curtains hung with different folds than I remembered creating. The journal entries became more detailed, more urgent. I wrote about the feeling of being slightly out of sync with my own existence, as if I were living a life that belonged to someone who resembled me but wasn't quite me. The handwriting analysis consumed hours as I compared current entries to older ones, searching for evidence of gradual change or sudden shifts that might indicate external influence. Sleep, when it came, brought dreams that felt more like memories of experiences I'd never had. Conversations with people I didn't recognize but who seemed to know me intimately. Places that felt familiar despite being geometrically impossible. Situations that carried emotional weight without context. I would wake with the sense that important information had been communicated, but I could never quite recall what it was. The house itself seemed to be keeping secrets. Floorboards creaked in sequences that sounded almost musical. Windows rattled in rhythms that didn't match the wind outside. The heating system made sounds I'd never heard before, subtle clicks and whispers that suggested mechanical complexity beyond what I knew existed in the walls. I began measuring things, the distance between furniture pieces, the height of pictures on walls, the exact position of items in drawers and cabinets. My measurements revealed tiny inconsistencies, shifts of inches or fractions of inches that could be explained by settling or temperature changes, but which accumulated into a pattern that suggested something more deliberate. The cream-colored envelope appeared again, this time containing a different sheet of paper with different handwriting that still looked like mine. The words described events I might have experienced but couldn't remember, conversations that sounded plausible, emotions that felt authentic, observations that matched my usual thought patterns. Reading these accounts was like discovering a diary I'd written while sleepwalking. Time itself seemed unreliable. Activities that should have taken minutes stretched into hours, while entire afternoons disappeared without trace. I would begin a simple task and find myself standing in a different room with no memory of moving, holding objects I didn't remember picking up, with the sense that significant time had passed though the light outside hadn't changed. The grocery store clerk's behavior became more pronounced. She would nod at me before I entered her line, as if she'd been expecting me. Her questions about my day were too specific, referencing activities I hadn't mentioned and couldn't remember participating in. When she handed me my change, she would hold my gaze just a moment too long, as if waiting for me to acknowledge something unspoken. I started avoiding mirrors, not from fear but from confusion. My reflection had become unreliable, showing me expressions I wasn't making, gestures I wasn't performing. The delay between movement and reflection grew more pronounced until I began to wonder if I was seeing my own image at all, or if the mirror was somehow showing me someone else who moved in patterns similar to my own. The telephone calls increased in frequency but decreased in content. Callers would remain silent for longer periods, breathing softly into the receiver. When they did speak, their words seemed chosen carefully, as if each conversation were following a predetermined script with minor variations. I began to recognize the pauses, the inflections, the subtle emphasis on certain words that seemed to carry meanings beyond their literal definitions. The photograph by the window drew me back repeatedly. I found myself having conversations with the woman in the image, asking her questions about what she could see from her frozen perspective. Her expression seemed to change depending on my mood, sympathetic when I felt confused, concerned when I felt anxious, knowing when I felt suspicious. The hand resting on the unseen shoulder began to look protective rather than casual, as if she were shielding someone from view. My handwriting continued to evolve, becoming more precise in some ways, more erratic in others. Letters that had always slanted right began to slant left. my signature shortened, then lengthened, then incorporated flourishes I'd never used before. When I tried to write in my old style, my hand would cramp, as if the muscles had been retrained without my conscious participation. The journal became my anchor to some version of reality, though I was no longer certain which version that was. I wrote about the small changes, the subtle shifts, the accumulating evidence that my life was being lived by someone who understood me better than I understood myself. The entries became longer, more detailed, filled with observations that seemed important but whose significance I couldn't decode. Food continued to taste different, but I began to suspect the changes weren't random. Someone with intimate knowledge of my preferences was making adjustments, reducing salt in dishes I'd grown tired of, adding spices to foods I'd been craving without realizing it. The modifications improved flavors in ways I wouldn't have thought to try myself, suggesting a palate more sophisticated than my own. The house developed new sounds, subtle creaks that formed patterns, whistles in the plumbing that seemed almost melodic, electrical hums that rose and fell in rhythms that reminded me of breathing. I began to listen for these sounds, finding comfort in their regularity even as their source remained mysterious. They seemed to respond to my presence, growing louder when I paid attention, softer when I tried to ignore them. The woman in the photograph became my confidant. I would tell her about my discoveries, my theories, my growing certainty that my life was being gently guided by someone with access to my most private thoughts. Her expression remained constant, but I began to see approval in her eyes, encouragement in her slight smile, understanding in the way her head tilted toward the camera. The cream-colored envelopes arrived with increasing frequency, each containing handwriting that looked more like mine than my actual handwriting did. The content described a life that paralleled my own, but with small improvements, better decisions, more thoughtful responses, increased awareness of opportunities I'd been missing. Reading these accounts felt like receiving advice from a wiser version of myself. Sleep became a negotiation between consciousness and dreams that felt more real than waking life. In these dreams, I lived in the same house but with subtle differences. Colors were more vivid, sounds were clearer, my movements felt more graceful, my thoughts more organized. I would wake with the sense that I'd been visiting a better version of my existence, one that was somehow more authentic than the life I returned to. The mirror in the bathroom finally stopped reflecting my image entirely, showing instead an empty room that looked like mine but wasn't quite. The lighting was different, warmer. The towels hung more neatly. The medicine cabinet was organized with a precision I'd never achieved. I found myself preferring this view to my actual reflection, spending long minutes studying this improved version of my private space. The grocery store clerk began to pack my items in a specific order, grouping things in ways that made perfect sense but that I'd never requested. She would include small items I'd forgotten I needed batteries when mine were running low, stamps when I had letters to mail, throat lozenges when I felt the first signs of a cold. Her selections were always correct, always timely, always exactly what I would have chosen if I'd been more attentive to my own needs. I stopped questioning the changes and began appreciating them. The subtle improvements to my daily life, the gentle corrections to my habits, the gradual refinement of my environment, all seemed designed to help me become a better version of myself. Whoever was making these adjustments understood me completely and wanted only to enhance my existence in ways I was too limited to imagine on my own. The journal entries became expressions of gratitude rather than records of suspicion. I wrote about the small kindnesses being done for me, the thoughtful modifications to my routine, the careful attention being paid to my comfort and well-being. My handwriting grew more elegant as I described these gifts, as if the act of acknowledging them was improving my motor control. The photograph by the window revealed its final secret when I realized the woman wasn't looking at the camera at all, but at me, specifically in this moment, reading these words, understanding these thoughts. Her expression combined patience with affection, as if she'd been waiting a very long time for me to notice her presence. The hand on the unseen shoulder was her own hand, resting on her own shoulder, a gesture of self-comfort that I recognized because I made it myself when I was thinking deeply about something important. The house settled into its new rhythms, and I settled with it. The sounds became familiar music, the changes became welcome improvements, the sense of being observed became the comfort of being understood. I learned to trust the adjustments being made to my life, knowing they came from someone who knew me better than I knew myself and who wanted only the best for me. The clock chimed twice again this morning, though I'd only heard it once. The gentle hum from the radiator rose and fell like a distant echo in a sleeping forest. My eyes traced the familiar pattern of the rug, its colors now perfectly matched to my preferences. The blinds swayed in rhythm with a heartbeat I could finally feel. The scent of perfectly toasted bread lingered from a toaster that had learned exactly how I liked it. As I reached for my mug, its handle felt warm with anticipation, ready to hold whatever I chose to fill it with. Story 5. The weight of paper. I told them I hadn't looked at the files, just a routine check, I said, nothing out of the ordinary. The air was stale, carrying the slight scent of papers that had aged in a forgotten corner. A flickering bulb cast restless shadows over stacks of folders too organized, too untouched. My eyes caught the corner of a page peeking out, its surface scarred with faded ink marks that seemed to pulse with a rhythm all their own. The silence was a blanket, heavy and smothering, broken only by the distant hum of machines. I hadn't touched anything, I told myself again, but the thin film of dust now felt familiar on my fingertips. But lies have a way of rotting from the inside out, don't they? The truth is I had opened that file. The truth is I had read every word, studied every photograph, traced the timeline with my finger until the paper felt warm beneath my touch. The case had been closed for months, archived and forgotten, just another stack in an endless sea of human tragedy. Yet something about it called to me that evening, something in the way the folder sat slightly askew, as if it had been waiting. The victim's name was redacted in my mind now, just another face in a sea of the forgotten, but her story clung to me like smoke. She had been found in her apartment on a morning when the world outside continued its relentless march forward, oblivious to the stillness that had settled over her small living space. No signs of forced entry, no obvious struggle, just a woman who had simply stopped existing between one breath and the next. I remember running my thumb along the edge of the crime scene photographs, the glossy surface cool against my skin. The apartment looked almost peaceful in those images, if you could ignore the chalk outline on the hardwood floor. A coffee cup sat half empty on the kitchen counter, lipstick still marking the rim in a perfect crescent moon. The television remained on, casting its blue glow across walls decorated with family photos and inspirational quotes written in elegant script. The investigating officer's notes were thorough, methodical. I could hear his voice in the careful handwriting, the way each observation was recorded with clinical precision. No defensive wounds, no signs of robbery. The door had been locked from the inside, the chain still engaged when the landlord finally used his key after neighbors complained about the smell. Natural causes, the coroner had concluded. Heart failure in an otherwise healthy woman barely past her 30th year. But something about the scene photographs nagged at me, a persistent itch I couldn't quite scratch. I found myself returning to the file again and again, each time telling myself it would be the last The woman's bedroom showed signs of recent activity. The bed was unmade, sheets twisted as if she had struggled with sleep. A book lay open on the nightstand, reading glasses folded neatly beside it. The bookmark suggested she had been near the end, just a few pages from discovering how the story concluded. I began to notice details that seemed insignificant in isolation, but formed a pattern when viewed together. The woman's purse sat by the front door, car keys visible in the open zipper pocket, as if she had been preparing to leave. Her coat hung on the back of a chair rather than in the closet where the other garments were meticulously organized. Small things, easily overlooked, but they painted a picture of someone whose routine had been disrupted. The neighbor interviews revealed little of substance. She kept to herself, they said. Quiet, polite, always paid her rent early. No boyfriend that anyone knew of, though occasionally they heard voices through the thin walls. Television, they assumed. Everyone watches television. But one neighbor, an elderly man who lived directly below, mentioned the footsteps. Heavy footsteps, he said, pacing back and forth across the ceiling during the late hours. Unusual for such a petite woman, he thought, but perhaps she couldn't sleep. I found myself walking past her building one evening, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't name. The windows of her former apartment were dark, new tenants not yet moved in. The landlord had mentioned the difficulty in finding someone willing to rent the space, despite the reasonable price and convenient location. People can sense tragedy, he said, even when they don't know the details. It leaves a residue that no amount of cleaning can remove. Standing on the sidewalk below, I tried to imagine her final evening. Had she been alone or had someone been with her? The coroner's report mentioned no signs of recent sexual activity, no foreign DNA under her fingernails, nothing to suggest violence of any kind. Yet the positioning of her body seemed wrong somehow, too carefully arranged, too peaceful for someone who had simply collapsed from heart failure. The woman's phone records showed nothing unusual. A few calls to family members, routine conversations with coworkers, the occasional order for food delivery. Her internet history revealed a mundane existence of social media scrolling, online shopping, and streaming services. But buried in the browsing data was a search that made me pause. She had been looking up information about restraining orders, about what to do when someone won't leave you alone. I decided to speak with her coworkers, telling myself it was just curiosity, just a desire to understand the woman behind the file. They described her as dedicated, reliable, someone who arrived early and stayed late, but in recent weeks they said she had seemed distracted. Phone calls that made her step outside, glances toward the parking lot as if she was expecting someone, or perhaps afraid someone might appear. Her supervisor, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and worry lines etched deep around her mouth, mentioned the flowers. Beautiful arrangements that arrived at the office with increasing frequency, always unsigned, always delivered when the woman was away from her desk. At first she seemed pleased, even flattered, but as the deliveries continued, her reaction changed. The last bouquet had gone straight into the trash, the supervisor recalled, the woman's hands shaking as she threw away the pristine white lilies. I obtained the security footage from her office building, spending hours watching her final weeks play out in grainy black and white. There, captured in stuttering frames, was the change others had described. The way she hesitated before leaving the building, scanning the parking lot carefully. The manner in which she clutched her purse closer to her body, keys already in hand before she reached the exit. And in one frame, barely visible in the distance, a figure that seemed to be watching from across the street. The figure appeared in multiple recordings, always at the edge of the frame, always partially obscured. A person of average height and build, wearing dark clothing and a baseball cap pulled low. They never approached directly, never made contact, but their presence was consistent. A shadow that followed her movements, a constant reminder that she was being observed. I began to understand why her apartment had felt wrong that morning when she was found. The careful positioning of her body, the lack of any signs of struggle, the peaceful expression on her face. Someone had been there with her when she died. Someone who had taken the time to arrange the scene, to create the illusion of natural death. Someone who had locked the door from the inside and found another way out. The building's layout became my obsession. I studied the floor plans, walked the hallways, examined every possible exit. The fire escape outside her bedroom window showed signs of recent use, though the investigating officer had attributed the disturbed rust to maintenance work. But maintenance records showed no recent activity on that particular escape route. The window itself had been found slightly open, unusual for someone who was reportedly concerned about security. I tried to trace the flower deliveries, but the florist's records were incomplete. Cash transactions, they said, always paid in advance by someone who claimed to be a secret admirer. The delivery person remembered only that the orders came from a voice on the phone, instructions given in careful, measured tones. Never the same person picking up, always someone different, as if the real buyer was deliberately obscuring their identity. The woman's family provided additional pieces to the puzzle. She had mentioned feeling watched, they said, being followed. But when pressed for details, she became evasive, claiming it was probably nothing, just her imagination running wild. Her sister recalled a conversation where she mentioned changing her routine, taking different routes to work, varying her schedule. Precautions that suggested the threat was real, immediate, and persistent. Medical records revealed that she had been prescribed medication for anxiety in the weeks before her death. Her doctor noted increased stress levels, complaints of insomnia, a general sense of being overwhelmed. But when asked about the source of her anxiety, she had been reluctant to provide specifics. Personal matters, she said, nothing that couldn't be handled. The prescription had been filled but barely touched, as if she was reluctant to dull her senses when she felt the need to remain alert. I found myself drawn deeper into her world, reconstructing her final days through fragments of evidence and half-remembered conversations. The picture that emerged was of someone living in quiet terror, afraid to seek help for reasons I couldn't yet understand. Perhaps she knew her stalker, trusted them enough to let them into her apartment that final evening. Perhaps the heart failure was induced, brought on by fear or something more deliberate. The toxicology report showed nothing unusual, but certain substances leave the system quickly, becoming undetectable within hours of death. The timing of her discovery, the delay between death and the arrival of authorities, created a window of opportunity for evidence to disappear. Whoever had been with her that evening had planned carefully, understanding both the limitations of forensic science and the assumptions that would be made. As I delved deeper into the case, I began to feel watched myself. A sensation of eyes following my movements, footsteps that seemed to echo my own. Perhaps it was paranoia, the natural result of immersing myself so completely in someone else's fear. Or perhaps whoever had ended her life was still out there, still watching, still waiting. The thought that they might have noticed my interest in the case sent cold fingers of dread crawling up my spine. I realized then that I had crossed a line, moved from curious observer to active participant in a drama that was far from over. The woman in the file had become real to me, her fear my own, her mystery a burden I couldn't set down. And somewhere in the shadows, the person responsible for her death might be preparing to add another chapter to their story. The file sits on my desk now, no longer hidden in the archives, but brought into the light where its secrets can't remain buried. I know I should report my findings, share my suspicions with someone who has the authority to reopen the case. But doubt creeps in during the quiet hours, whispering that I might be seeing patterns where none exist, creating connections that live only in my imagination. Yet the evidence speaks with a voice that grows stronger each time I review it. The woman was murdered carefully and deliberately, by someone who understood her routines, her fears, her vulnerabilities. Someone who could gain access to her apartment, who could induce heart failure without leaving obvious traces, who could arrange a scene to fool even experienced investigators. The truth sits heavy in my chest, a weight that grows with each passing day. Justice remains elusive, dancing just beyond reach like shadows cast by that flickering bulb in the archives. And somewhere out there, a killer walks free, perhaps already selecting their next victim, already beginning the careful process of observation and intimidation that will end in another unexplained death. I close the file but cannot close the case in my mind. The woman's face haunts my quiet moments, her story a reminder that some truths are too dangerous to speak aloud. The dust on my fingertips has become permanent now, a mark of my journey into darkness that no amount of washing can remove. Story 6. The main entrance was found ajar upon observation, despite the security system marking it as locked. A series of footprints traced a path through the dust of the entryway, leading towards the central hallway. Cabinets and drawers exhibited no signs of disturbance. An overhead light flickered slightly but remained functional. A single shoe rested by the threshold, introduced without its pair or conceivable purpose. The thermostat read an improbable 60 degrees, though the air was notably warmer. Surveillance recordings were unavailable for review, and yet all cameras remained operational. The smell comes first, always the smell. It's like wet cardboard mixed with something metallic. I keep trying to place it, but every time I think I have it, the memory slips sideways. Was it the basement, the storage room, that place we weren't supposed to go? I remember standing in that doorway. The shoe catches my attention because it's small, child-sized maybe, or just a very small adult. The leather is scuffed in a pattern that looks deliberate, like someone scraped it against concrete repeatedly. Back and forth, back and forth. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The footprints in the dust tell a story I can't quite read. They start at the threshold and move inward, but they're not consistent. Some are deep, pressed into the grime like someone was carrying weight. Others are light, almost ghostly impressions. And there are gaps, places where you'd expect to see a print but find nothing. I was there to check on things, that's what I tell myself. Someone had called about the lights being on when they shouldn't be. Or maybe it was the opposite. The details blur together now, like looking through water. The hallway stretches ahead, longer than it should be in a building that size. The walls are that institutional beige that's meant to be calming but just feels hollow. There are marks on the paint, scuffed marks at shoulder height running parallel to the floor, like someone had been dragged. No, that's not right. Like someone had been leaning against the wall, sliding along it, supporting themselves. The flickering light creates this rhythm, on off, it's almost hypnotic. I find myself counting the intervals, but they're not regular. Sometimes it holds steady for what feels like forever, then stutters rapidly, like Morse code, like it's trying to tell me something. I should have brought backup, that's what protocol says, but I didn't think it was necessary. The place felt empty, abandoned. Even with the footprints, even with that shoe sitting there like an accusation, it felt hollow. The thermostat is mounted too high on the wall. You'd need a ladder to reach it, or you'd have to be very tall. The display glows green in the dim hallway, those digital numbers clear and definite, 60 degrees, but I'm sweating. The air is thick, almost tropical. It doesn't make sense. I remember reaching for my radio, the static burst that came through when I keyed the mic, and underneath it something else. A sound that might have been breathing, or whined through a broken window, or someone whispering my name. The cameras are dark eyes watching from the corners, red lights blinking steadily, recording nothing, or recording everything and hiding it somewhere I can't find it. The wires run along the ceiling in neat parallel lines, disappearing into junction boxes that hum with electricity. I followed the footprints because that's what you do. You follow the evidence, but these prints seem to multiply as I walk. What started as one clear trail becomes two, then three. Different shoe sizes, different gates, some heading deeper into the building, others circling back. There's a room at the end of the hall. The door is closed but not locked. The handle turns easily under my palm, and there's that smell again, stronger now. The wet cardboard and metal, but something else too, something organic and warm. The room is empty, completely empty, but the dust pattern on the floor suggests it wasn't always that way. Rectangular impressions where furniture once stood, circular marks from chair legs, and in the center a space that's been swept clean, deliberately clean, like someone was trying to erase something. I keep thinking about that shoe. Why just one? Where's its partner? And why leave it so prominently displayed right there where anyone entering would see it? My flashlight beam catches something in the corner, a piece of paper folded small and wedged behind a heating vent. When I unfold it, the writing is faded, almost illegible. It looks like a list of some kind. Names maybe, or addresses, but I can't make out the words clearly enough to be sure. The building settles around me with small creaks in size, old wood expanding and contracting, pipes ticking behind the walls, normal sounds, but they feel amplified in the silence. Each noise makes me pause and listen, waiting for something that never comes. I should document everything, take photos, measure the footprints, bag the shoe as evidence, but something stops me. Some instinct that says touching these things will change them, or change me. The flickering light follows me as I move through the building, not the same fixture, but others. Like the electrical problem is spreading, or like something is moving through the system ahead of me, triggering each light in sequence. There are more rooms, all empty, all with that same pattern of missing furniture and swept-clean centers, and in each one the temperature reading is wrong. The thermostats all say 60 degrees. The air all feels like summer. I find myself back at the entrance without meaning to return there. The shoe is still there, but now it looks different, more worn, more familiar, like I've seen it before in another context, on another foot. The footprints seem clearer now too, less random. I can see the pattern they make, the way they circle and overlap. It's almost like a dance, or a ritual. People moving in careful, predetermined steps around some central point. My radio crackles again. This time the voice is clearer, asking for my status, asking if I've found anything. I key the mic to respond, but the words don't come. How do you explain something you don't understand? How do you report evidence that doesn't make sense? The smell is fading now, or maybe I'm getting used to it, but I can still taste it in the back of my throat, metallic and thick, like blood but not quite, like fear but not exactly. I realize I've been here longer than I intended. The light outside the windows has changed, though I can't say if it's gotten darker or brighter. Time feels elastic in this place, stretching and compressing without warning. The surveillance system hums in its metal cabinet by the door. All those cameras, all that recording capacity, and nothing to show for it. The hard drives are there, spinning quietly, but when I check the playback, there's only static, white noise where images should be. I think about the person who called this in. Did they see something, hear something? Or did they just feel what I'm feeling now, this sense that something is wrong in a way that can't be quantified or explained? The shoe draws my attention again. I crouch beside it, careful not to touch. The leather is good quality, expensive, well cared for despite the scuffing. There's a small mark on the heel that might be initials, but they're too worn to read clearly. Standing up, I notice my own footprints in the dust now. Fresh marks overlaying the older ones, creating new patterns and confusion. In a few hours, someone else might come here and find my prints mixed with the others, and they'll have to wonder about me too. The building holds its secrets close. Each room I've searched feels like it's waiting for me to leave so it can rearrange itself, put back whatever was taken away, restore whatever was swept clean. I key my radio one more time, report that the building is secure, no signs of forced entry, no immediate threats. All true technically, but the static that comes back sounds like laughter, or crying, or just the wind through broken glass. The thermostat by the door still reads 60 degrees as I prepare to leave. The air still feels warm and thick. The shoe still sits by the threshold, waiting for its owner to return, or waiting for someone else to claim it. The smell lingers on my clothes, in my hair, that wet cardboard and metal scent that I'll carry with me long after I've locked the door behind me, long after I've filed my report and moved on to other cases, other mysteries. But I know I'll be back, not officially maybe, not because the job requires it, but because this place has gotten into me now, the way unsolved things do, the way questions without answers burrow deep and refuse to let go. The flickering light follows me to the exit, pulsing in that same irregular rhythm. On, off, like a heartbeat, like a message I'm not smart enough to decode. I step over the shoe on my way out, careful not to disturb it. Evidence should be preserved, even when you don't know what it's evidence of, even when you're not sure you want to know. The door closes behind me with a soft click, but I can hear it settling open again before I reach my car. The security system will mark it as locked, but it won't be. It never really was. And somewhere in that empty building, in those swept clean rooms with their impossible temperatures and missing furniture, something waits, patient and quiet and utterly still. The smell follows me home, story 7. I assured them that I had simply taken the wrong turn. The air was heavy, a dampness that settled in my lungs as if I had held my breath too long. The path felt unfamiliar underfoot, the earth yielding too easily as I stepped forward. A glint caught my eye, a solitary shard glowing dimly among the moss and stones, whispering tales of something shattered. I noticed the scent of rain-drenched soil, mingling with a sharper, metallic tang that clung to my senses like a forgotten promise. The trees around seemed to lean in, conspiratorial in their whispering rustle, arching shadows across the path that stretched and bent away from the light. I moved quickly, but the weight of the scene lingered, pressing against the edges of my consciousness. My pulse matched the distant echo of a sound that shouldn't have been there. The stain on my cuff, a dark and silent witness, said nothing. Now months later, I trace that same stain with my fingertip. The fabric has been washed countless times, but the shadow remains. Coffee, I tell myself, it was only coffee. The detective's voice echoes through my memory, distorted by time and repetition. He said something about patterns, about how people remember what they need to remember. I corrected him then. No, I said, people remember what haunts them. There's a difference. But was it his voice or mine that spoke those words? The case file sits before me on the kitchen table, pages worn soft from handling. I've read it so many times that the words have lost their meaning, become shapes on paper. The victim a woman, they said, though her face in the photographs seems to shift each time I look. Sometimes young, sometimes older, sometimes familiar in a way that makes my chest tighten. I remember the first interview. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in that particular shade of institutional yellow that makes skin look sickly. The detective, was he tall, short? His features blur together with others I've known, others I've imagined, but his questions remain sharp. Tell me about the morning you found her. Found her as if I had been looking. The woods behind the development were supposed to be off limits. Construction debris, they said, unstable ground, but the dog needed walking and the regular paths had become routine, predictable. I needed something different that morning, something that would shake loose the feeling that had been building in my chest for weeks. Or was it months? The dog pulled ahead, nose to the ground, following a scent I couldn't detect. I remember thinking how strange it was that animals know things we don't. They sense death before we do, fear before we feel it, truth before we're ready to face it. The shard of glass, it was blue, wasn't it? Or green, the color of sea glass worn smooth by forces beyond its control. I picked it up without thinking, turned it over in my palm. It was warm, which seemed wrong given the morning chill. Did you disturb the scene? The detective asked. I told him no, but memory is a liar and I've learned not to trust my own testimony. Did I kneel beside her? Did I check for a pulse that had long since stopped? Did I arrange her hair, smooth it away from her face in a gesture of tenderness toward a stranger? The stain appeared sometime after. On the drive home I noticed it, dark against the white cotton, spreading slowly as if the fabric were bleeding. My neighbor saw me return that morning. She mentioned it later, during one of those conversations that happen over garden fences, casual words that carry unexpected weight. She said I looked pale, shaken. She asked if everything was all right. I told her the dog had gotten loose, that I'd spent the morning searching. Another lie, or perhaps another version of the truth. In my mind, I had been searching, not for the dog, but for something I couldn't name. The woman in the woods, they never found who killed her. The investigation lasted months, a slow unraveling of leads that led nowhere. I followed it in the local paper, each article shorter than the last, the story gradually disappearing from public consciousness. But not from mine. I dream of her sometimes. In these dreams she speaks, though I can never remember her words upon waking. Her voice is familiar, like an echo of something I've heard before. Sometimes she's lying among the leaves and moss, peaceful, as if she chose that place to rest. Other times she's standing, watching me with eyes that hold questions I can't answer. The detective called me back twice, 3 times. Each interview felt like a repetition of the last, the same questions asked in slightly different ways, as if he were trying to catch me in some inconsistency. You're sure you didn't know her? I studied the photograph again. The face was ordinary, forgettable, the kind of face you might pass on the street without noticing. But there was something in the eyes, a quality I couldn't place. Sadness, maybe, or recognition. I don't think so, I said. Think, such a careful word. It leaves room for doubt, for the possibility that memory might be playing tricks. The truth is, I've seen that face before, not in life, but in dreams that preceded that morning in the woods. Dreams I dismissed as meaningless, the mind's way of processing the random debris of daily existence. But now I wonder if dreams might be prophecy, or if the act of dreaming somehow calls forth the dreamed. I've walked those woods many times since. The path has been cleared, the debris removed. New houses rise where the forest once stood, neat lawns replacing the wild tangle of undergrowth. But I can still find the place where she lay. The earth there feels different beneath my feet, softer somehow, as if it remembers. The detective retired. His replacement showed little interest in cold cases, in mysteries that had already consumed too much time and resources. The file was archived, filed away in some basement storage room where it will gather dust until the building is demolished or the records digitized by someone who never knew her name. But I kept copies, photocopies of photocopies, the images growing fainter with each generation. Her face becomes more abstract, less human, more like the suggestion of a face. Sometimes I think this is more honest, that we never really see each other clearly, only approximations filtered through our own needs and fears. The stain has faded but never disappeared. I've considered throwing the shirt away, but something stops me. It's become a talisman, a physical reminder of that morning when my life divided into before and after. Before I knew that death could be so quiet, so unremarkable. After I learned that some questions don't have answers, only endless variations on the theme of not knowing. I think about cause and effect, about the chain of small decisions that led me to that path on that particular morning. If I had chosen a different route, would someone else have found her? Would she still be lying there, becoming part of the forest floor, her story untold? Or would she never have been there at all? This is the thought that haunts me most, the possibility that my presence somehow summoned hers, that the act of finding created the thing found. It's an irrational fear, but rationality has little power over the deeper currents of the mind. The dog died 2 winters later. Old age, the vet said, nothing unusual. But I wondered if he carried some burden from that morning, some knowledge that shortened his days. He never showed interest in walking those woods again, would pull against the leash whenever I tried to lead him down familiar paths. Animals know things. I've started having the dreams again, the same woman, the same wordless conversation, but now she seems to be trying to tell me something urgent, something I need to understand. She points to the ground, to the place where the shard of glass caught the light. When I look, I see not one fragment, but many pieces of something larger that was broken long ago. A mirror, perhaps, or a window. The detective's words come back to me, distorted by time and repetition. People remember what they need to remember. But what if what I need to remember is that I should forget? What if the kindest thing would be to let her story end where it began, in silence among the trees? Yet here I am, writing these words, trying to make sense of fragments that may have no pattern, searching for meaning in the space between knowing and not knowing. The stain on my cuff has become a period at the end of a sentence I can't bring myself to finish. Perhaps that's enough. Perhaps the mystery isn't meant to be solved, but simply carried, a weight that reminds us how little we understand about the forces that shape our days. The woman in the woods remains nameless, her killer unknown, her story incomplete. But she is not forgotten. I close the file, stack the pages neatly, return them to their folder. Tomorrow I may read them again, searching for some detail I've overlooked, some connection that might illuminate the darkness. Or I may finally put them away, accepting that some truths are too large or too small for human comprehension. The stain watches from my cuff, silent witness to a morning when the world revealed itself to be stranger and more fragile than I had imagined. It says nothing, but its presence speaks volumes about the persistence of evidence, the way the past inscribes itself on the present in ways we don't always recognize. Outside, night is falling. The woods where she lay are now suburban streets, but I can still feel them there beneath the asphalt, patient and eternal. Somewhere in that darkness, questions wait for answers that may never come, and perhaps that's as it should be. Some mysteries are meant to remain mysterious. The stain agrees, saying nothing. Story 8. The calendar hung skewed, casting thin lines where none should be. Each tick of the clock seemed to pull at the edges of the room, drawing light into corners that hadn't existed before. My hand trembled as it traced the outline of the morning coffee ring, only to find another already forming beneath it. The pages of the newspaper shuffled softly, whispering secrets from yesterday. A breeze, neither warm nor cold, grazed my skin, but the windows remained shut. Something hummed beyond hearing, a presence waiting in the syncopation of my breath. When I turned, the door was open. The nausea comes first, always. A slow crawl up from somewhere deep, like oil seeping through concrete. It settles behind my ribs, heavy and patient. I've learned to recognize its particular weight, the way it makes my chest feel hollow while simultaneously filling it with something thick and wrong. The taste follows metallic, sharp, as if I've been sucking on pennies while sleeping. I don't remember opening that door. But memory is a liar, isn't it? It rearranges furniture when you're not looking, changes the color of walls, replaces faces with strangers who somehow know your name. The woman in the photograph on my desk, her smile shifts when I'm not watching directly. I swear it does, sometimes wider, sometimes not there at all. The house breathed differently that night, or was it morning? The distinction blurs now, like watercolors bleeding into each other. I remember standing in the hallway, my bare feet against floorboards that creaked in a pattern I'd never heard before. 3 short, 2 long, one that seemed to hang in the air longer than physics should allow. Her voice came from upstairs, calling my name but stretched thin, as if the sound had to travel through water to reach me. I climbed toward it, each step pulling me deeper into a thickness I couldn't name. The banister felt wrong under my palm, too smooth, too warm, like skin that had been waiting. I find myself checking the locks now, multiple times each night. Turn the deadbolt, test the handle, step back, repeat. The motion has become ritual, though I can't recall when it started. My fingers know the sequence better than my mind does, muscle memory carved from some necessity I've forgotten how to name. The photograph moves again, I'm certain now. She had been wearing blue that night, or was it white? The color shifts in my recollection like fabric underwater, rippling between certainty and doubt. Her dress, or maybe it was a nightgown, caught the light from the street lamp outside. But there are no street lamps on this street. There never have been. I remember her hands most clearly. Small, pale, with a scar across the knuckle of her ring finger shaped like a crescent moon. She'd gotten it as a child, she told me once, though the story changed each time she told it. A broken glass, a fall from her bicycle, a cat that scratched too deep. The scar remained constant while everything else shifted. The coffee grows cold while I'm thinking. When did I pour it? The cup sits in my hand, ceramic warm against my palm, but the liquid inside has that particular chill that speaks of hours passing unnoticed. Time moves strangely here now, like a clock with bent hands, marking moments that don't quite align with reality. I should have noticed the silence first. Houses have their own symphonies, pipes settling, floorboards expanding, the refrigerator's mechanical hum. But that night the silence pressed against my eardrums like deep water, so complete it felt solid. Even my breathing seemed muffled, absorbed by something hungry for sound. The stairs creaked under my weight as I climbed toward her voice. But looking back now, I realized the creaking came from below me, as if someone else was following my path, stepping exactly where I had stepped, but always one beat behind. I never turned to look. Her room was at the end of the hall, is at the end of the hall. The distinction matters, though I'm not sure why. Present tense feels more honest somehow, as if the past tense would be a betrayal of something still happening, still unfolding in the spaces between my thoughts. The door stood ajar, revealing a slice of darkness that seemed thicker than the hallway's shadows. Light from somewhere where caught the edge of her dresser mirror, sending a thin line of brightness across the far wall. But when I pushed the door open wider, the light disappeared as if it had never been there at all. I've been dreaming of water lately, deep, dark water that doesn't reflect light properly. I stand at its edge, knowing something waits beneath the surface, something that knows my name. The water doesn't move, doesn't ripple, but I can feel the current underneath, strong enough to pull me down if I step too close. She was sitting by the window when I found her, or lying on the bed. The memory shifts between the two images like a double exposure, both true and false simultaneously. Her back was to me, shoulders curved in a way that suggested sleep or sorrow or something else I couldn't name. I spoke her name, but it came out wrong, the syllables rearranged into something that wasn't quite human speech. The photograph on my desk is empty now. The frame remains, glass intact, but the image has faded to a pale rectangle that might once have held a face. I don't remember when this happened, only that it feels significant, like a door closing somewhere in the distance. My hands shake as I write this. The pen feels heavier than it should, as if the ink itself carries weight. Each word requires effort, as though I'm carving letters into stone rather than marking paper. The sentences want to rearrange themselves to tell a different story than the one I'm trying to remember. She turned toward me when I entered the room, or maybe she was already facing the door, waiting. Her eyes held a quality I'd never seen before, not fear, not sadness, but something older and more patient. Recognition, perhaps, as if she'd been expecting this moment for longer than either of us could remember. The floorboards beneath my feet felt soft, yielding like earth after rain. Each step left an impression that seemed to linger, marking a path I couldn't retrace. The room smelled of something I couldn't identify, not perfume, not flowers, but something organic and slightly sweet, like fruit just beginning to turn. I reach for the coffee cup, but my hand passes through empty air. When did I put it down? The desk surface shows no ring, no evidence that liquid ever touched its surface. But I can still taste the bitterness on my tongue, feel the ceramics weight in my palm. Memory and reality tangle like vines, each choking the life from the other. The conversation we had that night exists in fragments now, pieces of dialogue that float through my consciousness without context or sequence. Her voice saying my name, my voice asking questions I can't remember formulating, silence stretching between words like a physical thing, heavy with unspoken meanings. She stood up when I approached, or remained sitting. The two images overlay each other in my mind, creating an impossible geometry where she is both still and moving, both present and absent. Her dress, white now, definitely white, caught what little light existed in the room, making her seem to glow from within. The window behind her showed nothing. Not darkness, not the street outside, but nothing, a void that seemed to extend infinitely beyond the glass. I should have found this strange, should have questioned what had happened to the world outside, but the absence felt natural, as if the room had always existed in this pocket of nothingness. I've started leaving doors open throughout the house. Not intentionally I close them. I'm certain I close them, but I find them standing ajar when I return. The spaces beyond seem deeper than they should be, as if the rooms have expanded in my absence, growing additional corners where shadows can gather and wait. Her hand reached toward me, or maybe I reached toward her. The motion exists in my memory as a single gesture shared between us, neither active nor passive, but something that simply occurred, like water finding its level. Our fingers touched, and the contact sent a shock through me that had nothing to do with electricity. Her skin was cold, too cold, the kind of cold that seeps into bones and stays there, marking you from the inside out. But her touch was gentle, familiar, as if we'd performed this same gesture countless times before. Her fingers traced the lines of my palm, reading something written there in a language I'd never learned to speak. The newspaper on my desk rustles again, though no air moves through the room. The headlines shift when I'm not looking directly at them, rearranging themselves into messages I can't quite decipher. Words bleed from one column into another, creating sentences that make no grammatical sense but somehow convey meaning anyway. She spoke then, her voice so quiet I had to lean closer to hear. But the words she said exist in my memory as feeling rather than sound, a warmth that spread through my chest, a recognition that bypassed language entirely. I understood her completely without comprehending a single syllable. The room began to change around us, or maybe it had been changing all along and I was only now noticing. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. The ceiling stretched higher, creating a sense of vast space above our heads, while the floor felt more solid, more real than anything else in my experience. I close my eyes and see her face clearly now, not as it was that night, but as it had been before, laughing, crying, sleeping beside me on countless mornings. The memories feel borrowed, as if they belong to someone else but have been loaned to me for safekeeping. I wonder if I'm remembering correctly, or if I'm remembering at all. The mirror on her dresser showed nothing when I glanced toward it, not darkness, not our reflection, but an absence so complete it seemed to pull at the edges of my vision. I wanted to look away, but found myself drawn to that emptiness, as if it contained answers to questions I hadn't yet learned to ask. She stepped closer, closing the distance between us until I could feel her breath against my cheek. But she cast no reflection in that empty mirror, and neither, I realized, did we existed in that moment outside of light, outside of physics, in a space where normal rules no longer applied. The clock in the kitchen has stopped. I notice this now, though I can't say when it happened. The hands point to positions that suggest a time that never existed, not quite midnight, not quite noon, but something in between that speaks to moments measured differently. The second hand quivers between numbers, unable to decide which direction represents forward. Her lips moved against my ear, forming words that had no sound but carried meaning deeper than language. I felt rather than heard her tell me secrets about the nature of time, about the spaces between thoughts, about the way memory reshapes itself to protect us from truths too large to hold. The window glass felt warm when I pressed my palm against it, despite the void beyond. Heat radiated from its surface as if something burned on the other side of that nothingness, some fire that consumed absence itself. The warmth traveled up my arm, settling in my chest like a second heartbeat. I've been finding objects in places I didn't put them. A book open to a page I've never read, a glass half filled with water I don't remember pouring, a key that fits no lock in this house. They appear and disappear with a logic I can't follow, as if the house itself is trying to tell me something through the arrangement of ordinary things. She took my hand and led me toward the window, or away from it. The direction seems to shift depending on how I approach the memory. Her fingers intertwined with mine, and I felt the scar on her knuckle, that crescent moon mark that had become more real to me than her face. The void beyond the glass began to show shapes, not objects exactly, but suggestions of form that my mind tried to interpret as familiar things. A tree that might have been a person, a house that could have been a cloud, shadows that moved with purpose through the nothingness. I realized we were looking at a world that existed parallel to ours, visible only from this particular window at this particular moment. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, dramatically, until I could see my breath forming clouds in the air. But I felt no cold, only a numbness that started in my fingertips and spread slowly inward. She squeezed my hand tighter, anchoring me to sensation even as everything else began to fade. My reflection has returned to the bathroom mirror, but it's wrong somehow. The face looking back at me belongs to someone who has seen things I don't remember seeing, done things I don't remember doing. The eyes hold knowledge that feels foreign, as if they've been replaced with someone else's while I slept. She turned to face me fully then, and I saw that her eyes had changed. Not their color or shape, but their depth. They seemed to extend infinitely inward, containing spaces larger than the room we stood in. Looking into them was like staring into the void beyond the window, but warmer, more welcoming. Her mouth opened as if to speak, but no sound emerged. Instead, I felt her words directly, bypassing my ears entirely and settling into my understanding like stones dropped into still water. She was trying to explain something about the nature of presence, about the way some moments exist outside of time's normal flow. The house settles around me now with sounds I've never heard before. Creaks and sighs that seem to come from deep within the walls, as if the structure itself is dreaming and occasionally talking in its sleep. I've learned to listen for patterns in these sounds, convinced they contain messages I'm meant to decode. I remember reaching for her face, wanting to touch her cheek to confirm her solidity. But my hand passed through empty air, and I realized she had been fading even as we spoke, becoming translucent like morning mist. Yet her grip on my other hand remained firm, real, the only constant in a room that had begun to dissolve around us. The newspaper headline reads differently each time I look at it. Sometimes it reports events I remember, sometimes things that feel like they should have happened but didn't, sometimes stories that seem to be about my life but from a perspective I don't recognize. The date remains constant, but the day of the week changes, as if time itself can't decide which version of events is correct. She began to pull me toward the window, or maybe I was pulling her. The distinction had become meaningless. Our joined hands were the only solid thing in a reality that had turned fluid, changeable. The glass grew warm, then hot, then disappeared entirely, leaving only an opening into that parallel darkness. I felt myself stepping forward, crossing a threshold that existed in more than just physical space. The void welcomed me with a sensation like diving into warm water, except the water was made of silence, and the warmth was the absence of cold rather than the presence of heat. Everything familiar fell away behind me. The coffee cup sits before me again, full and steaming. When did I refill it? The liquid inside reflects the overhead light in patterns that seem almost intentional, like words written in a script I almost recognize. I lift it to my lips, but the taste is wrong, not bitter, not sweet, but something that belongs to a different sense entirely. I'm standing in the hallway now, though I don't remember leaving the kitchen. The floorboards creak in that same pattern, 3 short, 2 long, one that hangs in the air. My bare feet know this path, have walked it before, will walk it again. The stairs stretch upward into a darkness that feels familiar. Her voice calls my name from somewhere above, the sound stretched thin like light through water. I climb toward it, each step taking me deeper into a story I've told myself so many times it's become more real than the truth it replaced. The banister feels warm under my palm, like skin that's been waiting. The door at the end of the hall stands open, revealing that same slice of thick darkness. Light catches the edge of the mirror, sending a thin line of brightness across the far wall. But when I push the door wider, the light doesn't disappear this time. Instead, it grows stronger, revealing a room I've never seen before but somehow know intimately. She sits by the window, her back to me, shoulders curved in a posture that suggests infinite patience. The void beyond the glass shows shapes now, familiar forms moving through the darkness with purpose. I speak her name, and this time it comes out right, the syllables arranging themselves into something that sounds like home. When she turns toward me, her face is my face, her eyes are my eyes, her smile is the one I've been trying to remember. The scar on her knuckle spells out my name in a language older than words. I understand now why the reflection in the mirror was empty, why the photograph faded, why the house breathes differently. I reach for her hand and she reaches for mine, and our fingers meet in the space between memory and forgetting, between what happened and what should have happened, between the story I tell myself and the truth I've been running from. The contact sends a shock through me that has everything to do with recognition. The room expands around us, walls breathing outward until we exist in a space larger than the house, larger than the world outside. We are the only solid things in a reality made of questions, the only constant in a universe that rewrites itself with each heartbeat. She speaks, and I understand that we have been having this same conversation forever, that every moment of my life has been leading to this recognition, this understanding that memory is not about the past, but about the eternal present where all possibilities exist simultaneously. The calendar on the wall straightens itself, the lines falling into proper alignment. The clock resumes its steady rhythm, marking time that moves forward and backward with equal validity. The coffee cup empties and fills, keeping perfect time with my pulse. I am sitting at my desk writing these words. I am standing in the hallway climbing the stairs. I am reaching for her hand while she reaches for mine. All of these things are true. All of these moments are now. All of these memories are happening for the first time and the 1000th time. The door remains open, and through it I can see her waiting, patient as starlight, real as the scar on her knuckle that spells my name in the language of wounds that never quite heal. The void beyond the window has become a mirror, and in it I see myself reaching for a truth I've been carrying all along. Story 9. The front door didn't latch behind me. My fingers brushed the frame, expecting the usual click, but the silence stretched out like a taut string. The air inside the house felt untouched, as if it had been holding its breath. The hallway seemed longer, each step absorbed into a stifling quiet. I reached for the light switch, but the bulb remained indifferent to my presence. Shadows clung to the corners, stubborn and heavy. My hand trembled slightly, feeling the absence of what should have been a reassuring glow, a welcoming warmth. The rug beneath my feet felt unfamiliar, as if it had been moved, or perhaps it was I who had shifted. The darkness reminded me of that other house, the one where she lived before it all began to unravel. I can't remember when I first noticed the pattern. Was it the third call or the fourth? Her voice always carried the same tremor, the same careful pause before she spoke my name. Each time she would describe the same impossible thing, footsteps in rooms she knew were empty, doors that wouldn't stay closed, the persistent feeling that someone was rearranging her belongings while she slept. "You have to believe me," she said during one of those late-night conversations. The words came through the phone line distorted, as if filtered through water. "I'm not imagining this." But was I imagining the doubt in her voice, the way she seemed to question herself even as she insisted on her certainty? The case files are spread across my kitchen table now, months later. Photocopied reports, handwritten notes, witness statements that contradict each other in subtle ways. I run my finger along the edges of the papers, feeling their rough texture, trying to ground myself in something tangible. The first officer to respond wrote, "Complainant appeared agitated but coherent. No signs of forced entry observed. Advised to contact family members." The second report, filed 3 days later, multiple calls from same address, no evidence of criminal activity, possible mental health concerns noted. The third report never mentioned her name at all. I remember visiting her house that first time. The afternoon light filtered through curtains she claimed she hadn't drawn. Everything appeared normal: a cup of coffee cooling on the kitchen counter, a book left open on the sofa, reading glasses folded neatly beside it. But there was something in the way she moved through her own space, as if she were a guest who had overstayed her welcome. It started small, she told me, leading me through the rooms. A photograph turned face down. My keys moved from the hook to the counter, things that could be explained away. Her hands fluttered as she spoke, touching surfaces that seemed to reassure her they were still there. But then I began to find notes. She showed me the first one, a slip of paper with her own handwriting, words she swore she had never written. "You're not supposed to be here." I held the note up to the window, studying the familiar loops and curves of her script. The ink was blue, the same shade as the pen she kept by her telephone. The paper had been torn from the notepad beside her refrigerator. "I don't remember writing this," she said, but her voice carried an uncertainty that made me wonder if she was trying to convince me or herself. The investigation, such as it was, lasted 6 weeks. I interviewed neighbors who described her as quiet, reliable, someone who kept to herself but always waved when she saw them in the yard. The mailman mentioned that she had recently started asking him to ring the doorbell instead of leaving packages on the porch. She seemed nervous, he said, kept looking over her shoulder. But when I pressed him for details, his certainty began to fade. Maybe it had been going on for months. Maybe it was someone else entirely who had made the request. Memory is unreliable. I learned this long before I became involved in her case, but it's a lesson that bears repeating. Each time we recall an event, we alter it slightly, like making a photocopy of a photocopy until the original becomes unrecognizable. I find myself questioning my own recollections now. Did she really call me 7 times that week, or was it only 3? When she described the footsteps, did she say they came from upstairs or from the basement? The notes multiplied. She collected them in a shoebox, each one written in her distinctive hand, each one containing a message she claimed not to remember composing. "Why won't you leave? This isn't your house anymore. Stop pretending you don't know." I suggested she install a security camera. The footage from the first night showed nothing unusual, her moving through the house in her routine way, turning off lights, checking locks, disappearing upstairs to bed. But in the morning, she found another note on the kitchen table. The camera had been turned to face the wall. I didn't touch it, she insisted, but her eyes wouldn't meet mine. The handwriting analysis came back inconclusive. The samples matched her known writing, but the expert noted subtle variations that could indicate stress or fatigue, or deception or coercion. People don't always know when they're lying to themselves, the analyst explained. The mind has ways of protecting us from truths we're not ready to face. But what truth was her mind protecting her from? I started spending nights at her house, sleeping on the sofa with one ear open for sounds that might explain her fears. The house settled around us with the usual creaks and sighs of old wood adjusting to temperature changes. Once I thought I heard footsteps in the hallway, but when I investigated, I found only her, standing in the bathroom doorway with a confused expression. "I thought I heard something," she said. "It was probably me," I replied, though I hadn't moved from the couch. She nodded, but I could see the doubt lingering in her eyes. The breakthrough, if it can be called that, came during my fourth night there. I woke to find her sitting at the kitchen table, writing in the pale glow of the under-cabinet lights. Her movements were fluid, unconscious, as if she were transcribing something from memory. I watched from the doorway as she filled 3 pages with her careful script. When she finished, she folded the papers and placed them in the shoebox with the others. Then she turned off the light and walked past me without acknowledgement, her eyes fixed on some middle distance I couldn't perceive. In the morning, she had no memory of the incident. "What did the note say?" she asked when I told her what I had witnessed. I unfolded the papers and read her own words back to her. "I can't keep pretending this is my life. Every morning I wake up in this house and I don't recognize the person I'm supposed to be. The woman in the photographs looks like me, but I don't remember being her. I don't remember choosing this furniture, painting these walls, planting those flowers in the garden. Someone else lived this life, and now I'm trapped inside it, pretending to be her." She stared at me with the expression of someone hearing a foreign language. "I didn't write that." But we both knew she had. The medical evaluation revealed nothing definitive. No signs of neurological damage, no indication of substance abuse, no clear evidence of any condition that might explain her episodes. The doctor used words like dissociation and stress response, but his explanations felt hollow, inadequate to contain the complexity of what we were witnessing. "Sometimes the mind creates mysteries to avoid confronting painful realities," he said. "The unknown can feel safer than the known." I began to research her background more thoroughly. The house had belonged to her mother, inherited after a death she rarely discussed. Before moving in, she had lived in another state, worked at a job she had left abruptly, maintained relationships she had severed without explanation. "I needed a fresh start," was all she would say about that period of her life. But fresh starts require leaving something behind, and I began to suspect that what she had left behind was herself. The final note appeared on a Tuesday morning. I found it tucked under my car's windshield wiper, written in her familiar handwriting but addressed to me. "Thank you for trying to help her. She's not ready to remember yet, but maybe someday she will be. Until then, I'll keep writing these notes, hoping they'll lead her back to who she used to be." I drove to her house, but she was gone. The neighbors said they had seen her loading suitcases into her car the night before. She had waved goodbye, they said, as if she were going on vacation. The house stood empty for months before new tenants moved in. I drove by occasionally, drawn by an impulse I couldn't name. The new occupants painted the exterior, planted different flowers, hung different curtains in the windows. Slowly, the house transformed into something that bore no resemblance to the place where she had lived her borrowed life. I kept the notes. They sit in my desk drawer now, a collection of questions disguised as statements, mysteries that resist solution. Sometimes I take them out and read them again, searching for clues I might have missed, patterns that might reveal themselves with distance and time. But the more I study them, the less certain I become about what really happened in that house. Was she the victim of some elaborate psychological manipulation, or was she manipulating herself? Was someone else writing those notes, or was she unconsciously creating evidence of her own displacement? The case remains officially unsolved, filed away with other matters that defy easy categorization. But I carry it with me, a weight that shifts and settles in different places depending on how I hold it. Sometimes in the moments between sleep and waking, I find myself wondering if I'm remembering her story correctly, or if I've altered it over time to make it more comprehensible, more contained than it actually was. Memory is unreliable after all, and investigators are not immune to the mind's tendency to fill in gaps with plausible fictions. The front door of my own house latches properly when I close it. The lights respond when I flip the switches. My belongings remain where I place them, but occasionally I catch myself checking these things twice, running my fingers along familiar surfaces to confirm their solidity. Because I know now that the most disturbing mysteries are not the ones that involve strangers breaking into our homes, but the ones that suggest we might be strangers to ourselves. That the person we think we are might be nothing more than a story we tell ourselves, and that story might not be entirely true. The case taught me that some questions don't have answers, only deeper questions. Some investigations don't lead to resolution, only to a more profound understanding of how much we don't know about the people we think we understand, including ourselves. She never contacted me again. I don't know if she found what she was looking for in her new life, or if she simply learned to live with the uncertainty of not knowing who she really was. Perhaps those are the same thing. The notes remain in my drawer, silent witnesses to a mystery that may never be solved because it was never meant to be solved, only experienced, endured, and eventually accepted as one of those inexplicable fractures in the surface of ordinary life. I close the drawer and return to my other cases, the ones with clear victims and obvious perpetrators, the ones where evidence points in comprehensible directions. But part of my attention always remains focused on that other investigation, the one that taught me that the most unsettling crimes might be the ones we commit against ourselves, so subtly and gradually that we don't even realize we're both the perpetrator and the victim. The silence in my hallway feels different now, pregnant with possibilities I would rather not consider. I turn on the lights and they respond, but I can't shake the feeling that someday they might not, and I'll find myself standing in the dark, wondering who I really am and whether the life I'm living actually belongs to me. Story 10. I stood motionless in the half-light of the room, watching the long, heavy curtain. It caught my eye as it shifted slightly, though the air was still. A rustle, almost imperceptible, seemed to fill the silence with whispers that never quite formed. The shadows around it deepened, unraveling into corners they hadn't before, as if they knew secrets I didn't. The floor beneath felt strangely soft, like stepping on forgotten cushions that shouldn't be there. Time clung heavily to the edges of the room, yet nothing revealed itself. It wasn't until a single thread loosened from the curtain's hem that I noticed another had vanished completely, leaving an unsettling absence in its wake. The thread read thread, always read thread. I keep coming back to that, don't I? Like my mind won't let me move past it, but there are other things, fragments that slip in and out of focus. The sound of water dripping somewhere I couldn't see, or was it footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps in a hallway that seemed to stretch longer than it should? Someone was speaking to me, a voice low and careful. "You don't remember, do you?" But I do remember some things. The way the light fell across the wooden table, casting shadows that looked like fingers reaching. The smell of something sweet and cloying, like flowers left too long in stagnant water, and always, always that red thread. I was looking for something, or someone was looking for me. The distinction blurs now, like watercolors bleeding into each other on wet paper. There was a door that wouldn't open, or maybe it was a door that wouldn't close. My hand on the brass handle, turning, but nothing changing. It's better if you don't think about it too hard. Whose voice was that? It comes to me in pieces, never the whole sentence at once, like someone speaking underwater or from the bottom of a well. The curtain moved again, I'm sure it moved. But I'm not in that room anymore, am I? I'm somewhere else, trying to remember why the curtain mattered, why any of it mattered. There was a pattern, something I was supposed to understand. Red thread on dark fabric, weaving in and out, creating shapes that almost made sense. I had a conversation with someone about patterns, about things that repeat themselves until you stop noticing them. Like the way certain people always sit in the same chair, or how some voices carry further than they should in empty spaces. Patterns can be dangerous, they said, or I said. The memory shifts, and suddenly I'm the one speaking those words, warning someone else. But warning them about what? The floor was softer than it should have been. I keep returning to that detail because it was wrong, fundamentally wrong. Floors should be solid, dependable, but this one gave slightly under my weight, like it was hiding something underneath, like there was empty space where there shouldn't be. I bent down to touch it. My fingers found the carpet, thick and plush, but beneath that something yielded, something that shouldn't have been there. Don't. Just that one word, sharp and sudden. A command or a plea, I couldn't tell which. The voice seemed to come from the walls themselves, or maybe from inside my own head. The red thread had gotten longer, I'm certain of that now. It wasn't just a loose thread anymore, but a line that traced along the baseboard, disappearing behind furniture, reappearing near the window. Following it meant moving deeper into the room, away from the door. Away from safety, but why would I think that? There was music playing somewhere, soft, classical, the kind that fills spaces without demanding attention. But it kept skipping, the same few notes repeating like a broken record, or like someone rewinding the same moment over and over, trying to get it right. I found myself humming along, though I didn't recognize the melody. My voice sounded strange in that space, muffled and distant, like I was hearing myself from very far away. You always did that, someone said, hummed when you were nervous. But I don't remember being nervous. I remember being curious, then confused, then something else, something harder to name. The feeling you get when you realize you've been walking in circles, that the path you thought was leading somewhere has just been bringing you back to where you started. The curtain was heavier than it looked. When I finally touched it, the fabric felt dense and substantial, like it was woven from something more than thread. My fingers traced the pattern, following the red line as it wound through darker colors, burgundy maybe, or deep brown, colors that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. Behind the curtain a window, but the glass was fogged, or maybe it was just dirty. I couldn't see through it clearly, only shapes that might have been trees or people or nothing at all. Just distortions in the glass that suggested movement without confirming it. I pressed my palm against the window. It was cold, much colder than the room. The fog on the glass shifted slightly, creating new patterns, new suggestions of what might be on the other side. It's not what you think, the voice said again, closer now like someone standing right behind me, but when I turned, the room was empty. Just shadows and that soft, yielding floor, and the red thread that seemed to pulse in the dim light. I started following the thread more deliberately. It led me around the perimeter of the room, past furniture that looked familiar but felt foreign. A chair I might have sat in, a table I might have eaten at, but the memories attached to them were vague, uncertain, like trying to remember a dream after waking. The thread disappeared under a heavy wooden cabinet, old, substantial, the kind of furniture that gets passed down through generations. I tried to move it, but it was too heavy, or maybe it was bolted to the floor. My hands found the edges, searching for a way to shift it, to see where the thread went. Some things are better left alone. This time I was sure the voice came from behind me. I spun around, but again, nothing. Just the empty room and that persistent sense of being watched, of being part of something larger that I couldn't quite grasp. The music had stopped. I hadn't noticed when, but the silence felt sudden and complete. Even the sound of my own breathing seemed muted, absorbed by the walls and that strange, soft floor. I knelt down, pressing my ear to the carpet, listening for what I don't know. But there was something there, a faint vibration, like machinery running in the distance, or like voices, too quiet to make out words, but loud enough to know they were there. The red thread emerged from under the cabinet on the other side, longer now, definitely longer. It continued along the wall, climbing slightly, following the junction where the wall met the floor. In some places it was taut, in others it sagged, creating small loops and curves. I began to see the pattern, not in the thread itself, but in how it divided the room, creating boundaries, marking territories, separating this space from that one, safe areas from dangerous ones, but which was which? You're starting to understand. The voice was different now. Not warning or questioning, but almost proud, like a teacher whose student has finally grasped a difficult concept. But I didn't understand, not really. I understood that something was wrong, that the room held secrets it wasn't ready to reveal. I understood that the red thread was important, that someone had placed it there deliberately, but the why of it, the purpose behind the pattern, remained hidden. I found myself back at the curtain, though I didn't remember walking there. The fabric hung exactly as it had before, shifting slightly in air currents I couldn't feel. But now I noticed other details. The way the hem didn't quite touch the floor, leaving a gap just wide enough for the red thread to pass through. The thread continued on the other side of the curtain. I was certain of it now, though I hadn't looked. It wound around the room like a boundary or a trap, connecting things that shouldn't be connected, dividing things that should be whole. My hand found the curtain again, and this time I pulled it aside. The window behind it was broken, not shattered, but cracked in a spider web pattern that radiated out from a central point, as if something had struck it from the inside trying to get out, or from the outside trying to get in. The red thread passed through one of the cracks, disappearing into whatever lay beyond the glass. I pressed my face close to the window, trying to see where it led, but the fog in the cracks made everything unclear. Shapes that might have been familiar, or might have been nothing at all. "Don't look too hard," the voice warned. "Some things change when you observe them." But I was already looking, already seeing. The thread on the other side of the window, continuing its pattern in a space I couldn't quite access. Connecting this room to something else, somewhere else. Making the boundaries between inside and outside, between here and there, suddenly uncertain. The floor beneath my feet gave a little more, not just soft now, but unstable. Like standing on a surface that wasn't quite solid, that might give way entirely if I put too much weight in the wrong place. I stepped back from the window, but the red thread followed me. not physically, but in my vision, in my understanding. I could trace its path even when I wasn't looking directly at it, around the room, under the furniture, through the crack in the window, and back again. An endless loop that contained everything and explained nothing. The voice spoke again, but this time I couldn't make out the words. They blurred together, becoming part of the ambient sound of the room. The dripping that might have been footsteps, the music that might have been machinery, the whispers that never quite formed into meaning. I sat down in the chair that might have been familiar. The cushions were soft, welcoming, but they seemed to pull me down further than I expected, like sinking into quicksand, but slowly, gently, comfortable until I realized I couldn't easily get back up. From this angle, the room looked different. The shadows fell in new patterns, the furniture seemed rearranged. The red thread was more visible now, creating a complex geometry that divided the floor into sections. Some sections felt safe, others dangerous, though I couldn't say why. I tried to stand, but the chair held me, not physically, but through a kind of inertia, a reluctance to disturb whatever delicate balance had been established. The red thread pulsed gently in the dim light, keeping time with something I couldn't identify. My heartbeat maybe, or the vibrations I'd heard through the floor, or the rhythm of whatever machinery was running in the distance, maintaining the systems that kept this space functioning. "You can stay," the voice offered, gentle now, almost seductive. "It's easier if you stay." But staying meant accepting the pattern, becoming part of it, following the red thread wherever it led, even if that place was nowhere I wanted to go, even if it was a place I'd been trying to leave. The curtain moved again, and this time I saw what caused it. Not air currents, but the thread itself, pulling gently as it shifted and adjusted, maintaining its tension, preserving its pattern, drawing everything in the room into its design, including me. I closed my eyes, but that only made the thread more visible. It glowed against my eyelids, red and insistent, mapping the room in ways that light couldn't, showing me connections I hadn't noticed, relationships between objects and spaces that existed outside normal perception. When I opened my eyes again, the room had changed, or maybe I had changed and was seeing it differently. The furniture seemed closer together, the walls more distant. The red thread had multiplied, creating a web that connected everything to everything else. I was part of the pattern now, had always been part of it maybe. The thread passed through me as much as around me, making me both observer and observed, both hunter and prey, both the one who remembers and the one who is remembered. The voice spoke one last time, but now I recognized it as my own, speaking to someone else or to myself or to no one at all. The words echoed in the strange acoustics of the room, bouncing off walls that might not have been there, absorbed by a floor that gave way under the weight of secrets. "You don't remember, do you?" But I do remember. I remember the red thread and the curtain that moved without wind. I remember the soft floor and the broken window and the voice that might have been mine all along. I remember the pattern that connected everything and explained nothing. I remember standing in the half-light, watching the curtain shift slightly in still air. The thread loosening from the hem, another vanishing completely, the unsettling absence in its wake. And I know that I'll remember it again and again, each time discovering something new in the pattern, each time understanding a little less about what it all means, each time becoming more certain that the red thread leads somewhere I've already been and somewhere I'm still trying to go. The curtain moves, the thread pulls, the pattern continues. And I remain motionless in the half-light, watching it all unfold in the space between memory and forgetting, between what was and what might have been.